I was 17 when my father looked me in the eye and told me I was dead to him. 17, with shaking hands and a heart that wouldn't stop racing, holding the truth I had tried so hard to hide for months. The bathroom test had confirmed what my body had already whispered to me in missed cycles and morning sickness. I was pregnant. I thought maybe, just maybe, when I told him he would soften. I thought he would see his little girl, trembling, terrified, begging for help, and that his arms would open the way they had when I was a child crying over scraped knees. Instead, his hand came down on the kitchen table so hard the dishes rattled, and his voice, God, I'll never forget that voice, split the air like a whip. "You are a disgrace," he spat. "You've ruined this family's name." The silence after those words was louder than the shouting had been. My mother sat frozen, her lips trembling as though she wanted to speak, but didn't dare. My little brother stood in the doorway, eyes wide, too young to understand, old enough to know something had broken. And then my father did the unthinkable. He walked to the front door, yanked it open, and pointed out into the dark night. "Get out," he said. His face was red, his hands clenched, his voice shaking with rage. I thought it was a bluff. I thought if I hesitated, he'd come to his senses. But when I stood there, tears streaming down my face, clutching the hem of my shirt like a lifeline, he stepped closer and shouted, "Out!" The word echoed through me, final and merciless. I stumbled into the night with no bag, no money, no plan. Behind me, the door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place as though sealing me out of my own life. I stood on the porch for a long time, hoping, praying that it would open again, that my mother would rush out, that my father's anger would fade into regret. But the windows stayed dark, my breath fogged in the cool night air, mixing with sobs I couldn't control. I wrapped my arms around myself, pressing a hand against my stomach, and whispered to the child inside me, "I guess it's just us now." The first night was the longest of my life. I walked the streets until my legs ached, trying to find a safe place, but every corner felt dangerous, every shadow threatening. Eventually, I curled up behind a gas station, using my backpack as a pillow, though it carried little more than my school books. The ground was cold, the air smelled of oil and cigarettes, and sleep came only in broken fragments. When morning broke, I forced myself up, brushed dirt from my jeans, and told myself I had to keep moving. If my own father could throw me away, no one else was going to rescue me. At school, whispers followed me. My absence from home hadn't gone unnoticed, and soon the rumor mill churned. Some called me reckless, some called me easy, some pitied me. Teachers pulled me aside, their voices a mix of concern and judgment, offering pamphlets and sideways glances. The weight of their stares pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. But every time I wanted to crumble, I placed a hand on my belly and remembered why I couldn't. This baby didn't ask to be here. This baby deserved better than the shame people tried to drape over us like a shroud. The weeks blurred together in a haze of survival. I found temporary refuge at a shelter after a kind stranger pointed me toward it, but even there, I felt the sting of judgment. Other girls my age talked about prom, college applications, summer plans. My nights were spent on thin mattresses in rooms that smelled faintly of mildew, wondering if I'd ever be more than the girl who got knocked up and thrown away. I picked up shifts at a diner, bussing tables until my feet blistered, pocketing tips that barely covered bus fare and cheap meals. And when exhaustion threatened to swallow me, I reminded myself of the life growing inside me. I whispered promises into the dark, promises that someday I would give my child a home, a life better than the one I'd been given. And yet, even as I scraped by, even as I clawed my way through each day, I couldn't shake the bitterness. My father's words replayed in my mind like a cruel chorus. Disgrace, ruined, broken. I wondered if he ever thought of me, if my mother lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, if my brother asked where I had gone. But no phone calls came, no letters, no footsteps rushing to find me. I was erased, forgotten, and for years that knowledge burned like acid in my veins. But time has a strange way of reshaping pain. The baby grew, and with him my strength. Each flutter, each kick reminded me that I wasn't just living for myself anymore. I was living for him. And though I didn't know it then, though I couldn't imagine the way the years would unfold, that tiny heartbeat inside me would one day be the very thing my father's life depended on. The irony was almost poetic, but that part of the story would come later. For now, all I had was the road ahead, uncertain, brutal, but mine to walk. The shelter became my lifeline, though it never truly felt like home. The walls were peeling, the bunks creaked with every shift of weight, and the air carried a constant heaviness of too many broken stories crammed into one space. But it was a roof, and a roof meant safety from the cold nights on concrete. I was 17 and pregnant, the youngest in the dorm room, surrounded by women whose eyes had long since stopped expecting kindness. They watched me with a mixture of pity and caution, as if I were a fragile bird that hadn't yet realized how sharp the world's claws could be. At first, I cried every night, curled on a thin mattress with my hand on my stomach, whispering apologies to the baby for the mess I had brought him into. But over time, the crying dried up, replaced by a determination that surprised even me. I found a job at a diner 2 bus stops away, a greasy spoon where the smell of bacon and burnt coffee clung to my hair long after my shift ended. The owner, a gruff man named Carl, took me on reluctantly, muttering something about kids these days and trouble, but he needed the help and I needed the money. I scrubbed tables, carried plates heavier than they looked, and smiled at customers who sometimes left nickels as tips. My feet blistered, my back ached, but every dollar tucked into my apron pocket felt like a small victory. I saved each one in a coffee tin under my bunk at the shelter, counting and recounting at night as though the numbers alone could carry me into a different life. School became both a refuge and a battlefield. By day, I sat in classrooms with kids who whispered behind my back, their laughter sharp as broken glass. They saw the swell of my stomach, the way my clothes stopped fitting, and they pointed, smirked, judged. Teachers offered half-hearted kindness, slipping me pamphlets for programs I had already exhausted, their eyes betraying disappointment they never dared voice. But in the quiet of the library, bent over books, while my belly pressed against the desk, I found something that made the whispers dull. I was still smart. I was still capable. If I could survive the sneers and the fatigue and the endless ache of being unwanted, I could survive anything. And I swore to myself that I wouldn't just survive. I would build a life my son could be proud of. The months dragged and blurred, each one a test of will. I worked late into the night, sometimes stumbling into school the next morning with grease still under my fingernails. I studied by candlelight when the shelter's power cut out, the wax dripping onto my notebooks, while the baby kicked, as though reminding me he was listening too. I learned to stretch meals, turning packets of ramen into feast with stolen ketchup and a sprinkle of hope. And every doctor's appointment I managed to scrape together felt like a triumph, a reminder that despite the world's indifference, I was still keeping him safe. I watched the grainy ultrasound image of a tiny profile forming, and for the first time since my father's rejection, I smiled without forcing it. The day he was born was the hardest and most beautiful of my life. The contractions came in waves so fierce, I thought they would tear me apart, and for a terrifying moment, I wondered if I could do it at all. But then, through the haze of pain and fear, came a cry. Loud, angry, defiant. My son, my Daniel. I held him against my chest, his tiny fists curling into the fabric of my gown, his skin warm and alive against mine. Tears spilled down my face, not of sorrow, but of awe. "It's you," I whispered, pressing my lips to his damp forehead. You're mine, and no one will ever take you from me. In that moment, everything changed. The shame my father had thrown on me like chains fell away, replaced by a love so fierce it burned. The girl who had been cast out, humiliated, erased. She died the moment Daniel opened his eyes. In her place stood a mother, and though the road ahead was still lined with shadows, for the first time, I wasn't afraid to walk it, because I wasn't walking it alone anymore. The months after his birth were a blur of exhaustion and wonder, nights of broken sleep, his cries echoing through the shelter, mornings of rushing to the diner with spit up on my blouse and hope clutched in my tired hands. Every paycheck stretched thinner, every bill a mountain, but every smile from Daniel made the struggle worth it. When he wrapped his tiny hand around my finger, when his laughter bubbled up from his chest, I knew I'd endure anything for him. I whispered promises into his hair as he slept, that he would never know the rejection I had faced, that I would always fight for him, that no matter how hard the world pushed, I would push back harder. And through it all, my father's silence was a ghost in the room. Not a call, not a letter, not even a whisper through the family grapevine. It was as though I had ceased to exist the moment his door slammed shut behind me. At first, that silence gutted me, a wound that wouldn't close. But slowly, as Daniel grew, it hardened into something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, but strength. Because if he could live with pretending I didn't exist, then I would live by proving that I did. And someday, whether he wanted to or not, he would see what he had thrown away. Daniel's first years were the hardest, and yet, when I look back, they are the ones that shine brightest in my memory. Every day was a war of exhaustion and survival, but every laugh he gave me, every first step, every babbled word felt like a victory flag planted in soil I had clawed to make fertile. The shelter wasn't meant for raising children, but I made it a home as best I could. I decorated our small corner with scraps of color, posters from school, a blanket stitched together from donations, little toys I bought second-hand for $1. To others, it looked like nothing. To me, it was a fortress. When Daniel lay curled against me, his breath warm and even, I would whisper to him about the life I was building, about the dreams I still dared to hold. He wouldn't remember those whispers, but I did. They kept me going when my legs wanted to give out. The stairs followed us everywhere. At the diner, people assumed I was his sister until they saw the weariness in my eyes, the way my hands moved with practiced care to adjust his blanket. At the grocery store, mothers my age looked at me with pity or disdain, tugging their children closer as if my mistakes were contagious. And then there were the whispers I couldn't shield Daniel from. So young, such a shame. Where's the father? I answered them in silence, my head high, my grip on the stroller firm. They didn't need to know the answer. I knew. And someday Daniel would know too. But not yet. For now, his world was laughter and lullabies, and I would do everything to keep it that way. When he turned 3, we moved into a small apartment of our own. It was nothing fancy. Peeling paint, a leaky faucet, a radiator that groaned in the winter, but it was ours. No curfew, no shared bunks, no need to pretend we weren't intruding. I signed the lease with shaking hands, the keys cold in my palm, and cried that first night as I watched Daniel run across the empty floor, his laughter echoing off bare walls. It was freedom. It was dignity. And though I still scraped by on tips and long hours, though I sometimes skipped meals so Daniel never had to, I felt richer than I ever had in my father's house. School became my second battlefield. I had dropped out briefly when Daniel was born, the weight of motherhood crushing me under sleepless nights and constant demands. But I refused to let that be the end of my story. I enrolled in night classes, bringing Daniel with me when I couldn't find a sitter, rocking him in my arms as I scribbled notes under flickering fluorescent lights. Professors frowned, classmates whispered, but I tuned it out. Each test I passed, each credit I earned was a brick in the foundation of the life I was building. By the time Daniel was 5 and starting kindergarten, I had a high school diploma in hand and a plan forming in my mind. I wouldn't just survive, I would climb. Daniel grew fast, too fast, and with every milestone I felt both pride and fear. His first day of school, he turned to me with his little backpack slung too big on his shoulders, his eyes wide with excitement. "It's okay, Mommy," he said, patting my hand. "I'll be fine." I smiled, though my heart ached, because he was already learning strength in ways children shouldn't have to. He came home with stories of classmates who asked why his dad never picked him up, why it was always just us. I knelt by his bed that night, smoothing his hair, and told him, "You have all the love you need. Some people don't know what that looks like, but we do." He nodded sleepily, as though he already understood more than I wanted him to. The years blurred into a rhythm of work, school, and motherhood. I picked up extra shifts, sometimes standing behind the diner counter until my legs went numb, then rushing to night classes with a thermos of coffee that tasted like survival. Daniel sat beside me at the kitchen table while I studied, coloring in his books while I scribbled essays. He didn't complain. He never asked for what I couldn't give, and somehow he grew up gentle and kind. The kind of boy who offered his snack to a hungry classmate, who held doors open without being told, who hugged me after long shifts and said, "You're the best mom in the world." Every time he said it, I felt the sting of my father's words fade just a little more. I wasn't broken. I wasn't a disgrace. I was building something no one could take from me. Still, the silence from my family lingered like a shadow. Birthdays came and went with no calls, no cards. Holidays passed in the quiet of our tiny apartment, the two of us making traditions from scratch. Pancakes for Christmas morning, a paper crown for Daniel's birthday. I wondered sometimes if they thought of me, if my brother asked where I was, if my mother lay awake with guilt she couldn't voice. But then Daniel would laugh, his eyes sparkling, and I would remind myself that their silence was no longer my burden. They had chosen pride over love. I chose love, every single time. And in that choice, I found strength they would never understand. I didn't know it then, but every sacrifice, every long night, every moment I thought I couldn't go on was shaping not just me, but Daniel too. He grew into the kind of person my father could never have imagined. And one day, when life circled back in ways I couldn't yet foresee, it would be Daniel, my son, my miracle, my reason, who held my father's life in his hands. By the time Daniel entered his teenage years, I could see the man he was becoming, and every glimpse of it filled me with both pride and fear. Pride, because he carried himself with a quiet dignity that no hardship had managed to strip from him. Fear, because I knew too well how cruel the world could be to boys who carried kindness like a torch in a place that often rewarded fire instead of light. He was 14 when I first realized he had grown taller than me, his voice starting to dip into a lower register, and yet he still hugged me before heading out the door, still called me Mom, with a softness that reminded me that no matter how tall he grew, he was still my boy. He worked hard at school, pushing himself not because I demanded it, but because he wanted to see me proud. His teachers sent notes about his grades, about his leadership, about his potential, and I would sit in the quiet of our kitchen, reading them with tears in my eyes, whispering to myself, "This is the child they said I wasn't worthy of raising." Life was not easy, but it was steadier. I had clawed my way into something resembling stability. After years of scraping together credits and working nights, I finally landed a decent office job, one that didn't leave me smelling like grease and coffee, but instead gave me the dignity of a paycheck that could cover rent and still leave something left for savings. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. I decorated our small apartment with framed photos of Daniel's milestones, his science fair ribbons, his baseball team photo, his school awards. I wanted him to see every day what he had accomplished, to know that even if the world didn't always clap for him, his mother always would. Still, shadows lingered. Teenagers at school asked questions sharper than those of children. They noticed the absence of a father, the lack of relatives showing up at games or concerts, and their curiosity carried a cruelty they didn't even realize. Daniel would come home quieter on those days, pushing his food around his plate until I asked what was wrong. He would shrug, then finally mutter, "Why don't we ever see Grandpa or Grandma?" And every time, my chest tightened with a pain I could barely hide. I would tell him the truth. Piece by piece, never enough to poison his heart, but enough to give him context. I explained that sometimes people let pride destroy their love, that sometimes families choose silence over forgiveness, and that it had nothing to do with him. He nodded, but I could see the questions linger in his eyes. The first time I caught him researching family history online, I felt panic rise in me like bile. I didn't want him to stumble upon their names, to see photos of smiling relatives who had erased us from their story, to feel the sting of knowing he was blood but not welcome. So I sat him down, heart pounding, and told him everything. I told him about the night my father kicked me out, about the names he hurled, about the silence that followed. I told him how I had built our life from ashes, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. Daniel listened quietly, his jaw clenched, his hands folded. When I finished, he didn't look at me with pity or anger. He looked at me with something fiercer. "You don't need them," he said firmly. "And neither do I." His words carried me through the years that followed. When he got his first job at 16, bagging groceries and saving his paycheck for a car, I watched him walk in wearing a uniform too big for his lean frame and thought, this is what survival looks like passed down. When he got his first acceptance letter from a university, his grin stretched so wide, I thought my chest would burst with pride. I had raised him in the shadows of rejection, yet he had stepped into the light anyway. And every victory, every laugh, every moment of growth was a silent rebuke to the man who had once told me I was a disgrace, but the shadow of my father never fully left. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if he was still alive, if he thought of me at all, if he ever regretted the night he slammed that door. I told myself it didn't matter, that he was gone from my life, and that was how it would always be. Yet some nights, when the world was quiet and Daniel was asleep, I couldn't help but imagine what he might say if he saw the man his grandson had become. Would his pride crack then? Would his silence finally feel like the weight it was? I didn't know. And for years, I thought I never would. What I didn't realize was that fate was already setting the stage, that the same bloodline that had cast me out would soon come crawling back. Life has a way of circling, of forcing reckonings, whether we are ready for them or not. And when the call finally came, the call that would rip open old wounds and test everything I had built, it was Daniel, not me, who answered it with grace I never could have imagined. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, one of those ordinary days when life hums along in quiet routines until something splits it wide open. I had just finished paying bills online. Daniel was upstairs studying for his biology exam, and the house was filled with the comforting sounds of our normalcy, the clink of dishes in the sink, the soft hum of music from his room. The phone rang, and I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me picked it up. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, strained. "Is this Claire?" a woman asked. I confirmed cautiously, already sensing the tension in her tone. She hesitated, then said, "I'm calling about your father." The words made my blood run cold. It had been nearly 2 decades since I had heard his name spoken in connection with me. For a moment, I couldn't answer. My mind leapt back to that night, to the slam of the door, to the word disgrace ringing in my ears. I almost hung up, but the woman's voice pushed on, filling the silence. He's very sick. His kidneys are failing. The doctors have tested everyone in the family, but no one is a match. Her words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating me. No one is a match. I felt the cruel twist of irony before she even said the next part. We were told sometimes children or grandchildren can be potential donors. My hand tightened on the phone, my knuckles white, my pulse hammering in my ears. They weren't asking about me. They were asking about Daniel, the grandson my father had never met, the grandson he had thrown into the cold with me before he ever took a breath. I sank into a chair, my legs trembling beneath me. 1,000 thoughts collided in my mind. Anger at the audacity of them reaching out now after years of silence. Pain, because no matter how strong I had become, the mention of my father's name still pierced through me. And fear, because Daniel was upstairs, innocent, unaware, and his life, his body, his blood were now suddenly currency for the man who had once deemed us unworthy of family. I whispered into the phone, my voice shaking. I don't know what you expect me to say. The woman hesitated, then replied, We're desperate. He doesn't have much time. Please think about it. She gave me a number, and then the line went dead, leaving me staring at the wall as though it held answers it never could. I wanted to shield Daniel from it, to keep this poison from touching the life he had built, but secrets have a way of suffocating you, and I knew I couldn't keep it from him for long. That evening, as we sat at the kitchen table, I told him everything. I expected anger, maybe even hatred. I expected him to spit out the words I couldn't bring myself to. How dare he, after everything? How dare he call now, when he called me nothing before? But Daniel surprised me, the way he always did. He listened quietly, his brow furrowed, his hands folded calmly on the table. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long time, then said softly, So he needs a kidney. I nodded, unable to speak. He leaned back in his chair, thinking, then looked me in the eye. Mom, I'll do it. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. No, I said instantly, shaking my head. Absolutely not. He doesn't deserve it. He doesn't deserve you. But Daniel's face was steady, his voice gentle. Maybe he doesn't, but this isn't about him. It's about me. It's about who I want to be. You raised me to be kind, to do what's right, even when it's hard. And this feels right. My throat tightened with tears I couldn't stop. I wanted to argue, to protect him from the weight of this choice, but deep down I knew I couldn't strip him of the very values I had planted in him. This wasn't about my father anymore. It was about my son becoming the man he wanted to be. The days that followed blurred into a haze of hospital visits, blood tests, consultations. I sat beside Daniel as doctors explained the risks, the recovery, the seriousness of the surgery. He nodded calmly, never wavering, while I fought back waves of panic. Every fiber of me wanted to pull him away, to scream that he had already given me more than I could have ever dreamed, that he owed the world nothing. But I also knew that telling him no would be denying him the chance to prove, once and for all, that he was stronger than the hatred that had tried to bury us. And so, with a heart torn in two, I signed the consent forms, holding his hand so tightly my fingers ached. The night before the surgery, we sat together in his hospital room, the machines humming softly around us. Daniel turned to me, his face illuminated by the dim glow of the monitors. Do you think he'll even care? He asked quietly. I swallowed hard, unable to lie. I don't know, I admitted. But that's not why you're doing this. You're doing this because it's who you are. And that's enough. He nodded, then smiled faintly. If he doesn't see it, that's his loss. I brushed his hair back from his forehead, tears slipping down my cheeks, and whispered, No, baby, it's his loss no matter what. What neither of us knew then was that when my father opened his eyes after surgery, expecting reconciliation, expecting gratitude, what he would find instead was the full weight of his choices, staring him down in the emptiness of a room he thought would be filled. The morning of the surgery dawned grey and heavy, as though the sky itself understood the weight of what was about to happen. I woke in the stiff chair of Daniel's hospital room, my neck aching, my heart pounding with a rhythm that refused to calm. Nurses bustled in and out, their voices clipped and professional, but every sound grated against my nerves. I held Daniel's hand as they prepped him, my thumb tracing circles over his knuckles. He smiled at me, calm as ever, even with IV lines in his arm and a hospital gown replacing his usual easy confidence. "Mom," he said softly, "you're squeezing too hard." I loosened my grip, forcing a laugh through the lump in my throat. "Sorry, My voice cracked, and I had to swallow hard before I could continue. "I just wish it didn't have to be you." He shook his head gently, his eyes steady. "If it has to be someone, why not me? He may not have wanted us, but I know what it feels like to be wanted. You gave me that. Maybe this is my way of giving it back to the universe." His words, simple and sure, cut through me sharper than any knife. For all my sacrifices, all my nights of tears and toil, he had grown into a man who carried compassion like armor, and it terrified me, because compassion made him brave, and bravery meant risk. They came for him just after sunrise. I walked beside his gurney down the sterile hallway, my feet echoing on the linoleum floor, my heart begging me to turn back time, to undo every step that had led us here. When we reached the double doors of the operating room, I had to stop. They wouldn't let me in. A nurse touched my shoulder gently, guiding me away, and Daniel lifted his hand in a small wave, his smile faint but steady. "See you soon, Mom." The doors closed between us, and I stood there staring, the emptiness swallowing me whole. The waiting room was a prison of white walls and ticking clocks. Families sat scattered in stiff chairs, their faces masks of worry and exhaustion. I sat alone, clutching my phone in one hand and a crumpled tissue in the other. My thoughts spiraled, dragging me back to places I had tried to bury. I saw my father's face again, red with fury, the vein in his temple pulsing as he spat the word disgrace. I heard the slam of the door, the silence of my mother's absence, the way the night swallowed me whole as I stood outside, broken and abandoned. And now, after all these years, he was lying in a room not far from my son, his body dependent on the boy he had never wanted to acknowledge. The irony burned, but it didn't soothe me. It made me sick, because no matter how poetic fate had been, Daniel was still the one paying the price. Hours crawled by, each minute stretching into eternity. I paced the room until my legs ached, sat until my back stiffened, stood until my knees threatened to buckle. Every time the door opened and a doctor walked in, my breath caught, my body braced. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a surgeon entered, her mask hanging loosely around her neck. She looked tired but calm, and in that moment I clung to her expression like a lifeline. "The surgery went well," she said simply. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I nearly collapsed. My knees gave out, and I sank into a chair, my hand pressed to my mouth as sobs broke free. "He's okay," I managed to choke out. She nodded. "Both of them are stable. It will take time to recover, but everything looks good." I thanked her with tears streaming down my face, my heart aching with gratitude and terror all at once. Because while the surgery had been a success, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of the reckoning. When I was finally allowed to see Daniel, he was pale, his face drained of color, but his chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. Machines beeped quietly around him, tubes and wires tethering him to safety. I sat by his bed, taking his hand gently, terrified of hurting him. "You did it," I whispered, brushing his hair back from his forehead. His eyes fluttered open briefly, a weak smile tugging at his lips. "Told you I would," he murmured before drifting back to sleep. My tears fell freely, soaking the sheets. He had risked everything for a man who had given us nothing, and still he had no regrets. Later, I was led to another room, my father's recovery room. I stood in the doorway for a long time, my body frozen. He looked older, frailer than the man who had thrown me out. His once strong hands lay limp on the bed, his face sallow, his body thinned by illness. For the first time, I saw him not as the tyrant who had destroyed my world, but as a man beaten down by time, clinging to life that wasn't his own anymore. The bitterness inside me warred with pity, but pity didn't win. I turned and walked away, leaving him to wake alone. Back in Daniel's room, I sat watching him breathe, the soft rise and fall of his chest, the most precious thing I had ever seen. I knew we wouldn't stay. I knew that when my father opened his eyes, expecting reconciliation, we would already be gone, because Daniel had given him what he needed, but that didn't mean he deserved more. Gratitude wasn't enough to bridge 18 years of silence and cruelty. We had carried this burden long enough, and when the time came, we would walk away for good, leaving him with the knowledge of what he had lost and what he could never reclaim. When the doctors said my father was waking, I felt nothing but a hollow chill spread through me. For days, I had been rehearsing what that moment might look like. Would he be angry? Would he break down with tears and apologies? Would he even recognize me after so many years? I didn't know. But what I did know was that I would not be sitting at his bedside, waiting for gratitude he hadn't earned. I would not hold his hand or whisper comfort into ears that had once spit venom at me. He had made his choice the night he shoved me into the darkness. And this quiet, empty room he was about to wake into was its consequence. I left Daniel sleeping peacefully, his body recovering from the sacrifice he had just made. I kissed his forehead, whispered that I would be back soon, and slipped out. The hallway to my father's room felt colder than the rest of the hospital, each step echoing like a drumbeat of justice. When I reached his door, I didn't go in. Instead, I stood just outside, clutching the folded piece of paper I had written the night before, my handwriting sharp with anger and clarity. The nurse passed me in the hallway, nodding politely, and I handed the note to her. "When he wakes," I said softly, my voice steadier than I felt, "make sure this is the first thing he sees." She gave me a curious look, but I didn't explain. There was no explanation that would make sense to someone who hadn't lived through the wreckage of my childhood. Inside the room, monitors beeped steadily as my father stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. The nurse was there, placing the note on the table beside him. I didn't see his face, but I imagined it. I imagined the confusion first, the disorientation of waking after surgery, the flicker of hope that maybe his family had been by his side, that maybe the daughter he cast out had come crawling back now that he was weak and needy. I imagined the hope turning to expectation, expectation turning to smugness. Of course she came. Of course they all did. I'm still the patriarch, still the man of this family. And then I imagined his hand trembling as he reached for the folded paper. I imagined him opening it slowly, his eyes scanning the familiar scrawl of my handwriting for the first time in nearly 2 decades. And I imagined the words hitting him one by one, like stones. "The grandson you threw away just saved your life. You'll live, but not with us. We've already given you more than you ever gave us." I would never see the exact expression that twisted across his face in that moment, but in my heart, I didn't need to. I knew. The arrogance would collapse first, then the confusion, then the dawning horror of what those words truly meant. He hadn't been saved by his family. He hadn't been forgiven. He had been exposed. The life inside him now belonged to the very bloodline he had tried to erase, and he would never be allowed to claim it. While he sat with that truth, I was already gone. Daniel and I left the hospital quietly. No goodbyes, no explanations. Just the soft click of the door shutting behind us, the same way it had shut behind me so many years ago. But this time, I was the one walking away, and he was the one left in the cold. The symmetry of it struck me, and for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of peace. Back at home, I watched Daniel sleep on the couch, his face pale but serene. He had given a piece of himself to a man who had never deserved him, and yet he carried no bitterness. That was mine to hold, not his. I brushed his hair back and thought of the irony. of how my father's survival now depended on the child he had once condemned as my shame. A child he never wanted to exist. A child who had grown into the kind of man my father never was. I knew whispers would spread eventually. Family members would talk. They would want answers. They would demand explanations for why we had disappeared, for why my father's bedside had been left cold. But I also knew that none of it mattered, because in the end, it wasn't about them. It was about us. And we had given enough. We had given life itself. There was nothing more to give. My father would wake every morning from now on, feeling the strength in his body, knowing it wasn't his own. He would sit in his house, surrounded by people who had judged and whispered, and he would know that the blood keeping him alive belonged to the grandson he had never acknowledged. That knowledge would haunt him longer than any grudge I could carry. It was the perfect punishment. Life, not death. Survival, not peace. A reminder every single day of the family he had tried to erase and could never reclaim. The phone calls started almost immediately. First my mother's number, then my brother's, then cousins I hadn't spoken to in decades. One after another, their names lit up my phone screen, and one after another I let them go to voicemail. I couldn't bring myself to hear their voices. Part of me wondered what they would say. Would they beg me to return? Would they accuse me of cruelty, of heartlessness? Would they finally admit that casting me out had been a mistake? Or would they, even now, twist the story to make themselves the victims? I didn't want to know. For 18 years, they hadn't cared if I lived or died. They didn't get to care now, simply because their comfort had been ripped away. When I finally checked the voicemails, it was worse than I imagined. My mother's voice was shaky, desperate. "Claire, please, he's devastated. He says you left him a note, but he needs to see you, to see his grandson. Please, don't punish him like this. He's suffered enough." I threw the phone across the couch, shaking with anger. Suffered enough? The man who threw his pregnant daughter into the night had suffered enough. What about the years I spent in shelters, the double shifts, the hunger pangs I swallowed so Daniel could eat? What about the nights I lay awake listening to my baby breathe, terrified of what tomorrow would bring? If my father was suffering now, it was the faintest taste of what he had once forced me to swallow whole. Other messages came too. My brother's voice was harsher. "You're being selfish, Claire. He's dying. You can't just vanish. After what Daniel did for him, he deserves at least a conversation." I laughed bitterly when I heard that one. My father deserved a conversation? What had I deserved at 17, standing on the porch with tears in my eyes and no place to go? But there had been no conversation then, no attempt at understanding, just a slammed door and silence. And that silence, I decided, would now be his companion too. As the days passed, the calls grew more frantic. I ignored them all, focusing instead on Daniel's recovery. He moved slowly, wincing with every step, but his determination never wavered. He insisted on walking laps around the living room to rebuild his strength, teasing me when I hovered too much. "Mom, I'm fine," he would say, though I could see the pain in his eyes. He never complained, never once expressed regret, and that was what gutted me most. He had given his grandfather a chance at life without hesitation, even knowing the history, even knowing the ugliness of it all. One night, about a week after the surgery, he sat with me at the kitchen table, his face pale, but his eyes bright. "Mom," he said quietly, "did we do the right thing?" The question hit me harder than any accusation my family could throw. For a long moment, I couldn't answer. I stared at the wood grain of the table, my throat tight, my mind spinning. What was the right thing? Was it right to save a man who had once sentenced us to ruin? Was it right to walk away afterward, leaving him with nothing but a note? Or was it right because Daniel had followed his heart, even when mine was heavy with anger? Finally, I reached across the table, taking his hand. "We did the only thing we could do," I whispered. "You gave him a chance, Daniel. You gave him life. That doesn't mean we have to give him more. It doesn't erase the past, but it proves one thing, that you are nothing like him. And that's all I ever wanted. His fingers tightened around mine, his gaze steady. I don't care if he thanks me. I don't care if he hates me. I just wanted to be sure I wasn't carrying his hate forward. My chest ached with pride and sorrow all at once. My son was wiser than I had ever been, stronger than I had ever dreamed, and I knew then that no matter what anyone said, we had already won. Meanwhile, through whispered updates from extended family, I heard what was happening on the other side. My father was spiraling. He asked for us constantly, growing furious when no one could produce us, his temper flaring even in weakness. The note was found clutched in his hand more than once, the words smudged from where he had gripped it too tightly. Some relatives said he cried, others said he raged, but all of them agreed on one thing: he was unraveling. And I felt no joy in it, only a cold, sharp finality. He had wanted control until the very end, but control had slipped through his fingers the moment Daniel walked away. There was one message I listened to twice, though. It was from my mother. Her voice was cracked, raw. "I wanted to fight for you," she whispered. "All those years ago, I wanted to open the door. I wanted to bring you back inside, but I didn't. And I'm sorry, Claire. I'm so sorry I sat in the dark after listening to it, tears blurring my vision. Part of me wanted to call her back, to ask why she hadn't fought harder, to demand answers I knew she couldn't give. But another part of me knew that sorry didn't erase anything. Sorry didn't erase the hunger, the shame, the years of silence. Sorry was a bandage on a wound that had scarred too deep. In the end, I deleted the message without responding, because forgiveness wasn't mine to give anymore. My life had moved on. Daniel's life was just beginning. We had built something beautiful out of the ashes they left us in, and I refused to let their guilt, their desperation, pull us back into the ruins. And so, as the calls kept coming, I silenced my phone. As the whispers spread, I turned away, because the truth was simple. Daniel and I had given enough. We had given life itself, and there was nothing left to take. It was almost 3 weeks after the surgery when the knock came. I wasn't expecting anyone. Most people in our lives knew better than to drop by unannounced, and the sound jolted me from the dishes I was rinsing. Daniel was upstairs, still moving gingerly but getting stronger each day, and I didn't want him disturbed. My first instinct was to ignore it, but the knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. My stomach twisted as though my body already knew who it was. I dried my hands slowly, walked to the door, and through the peephole I saw him, my father. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. He looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, his posture stooped, his face was pale, his eyes sunken, but they burned with something I couldn't name. Desperation, maybe, or defiance. I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 decades, not since the night he cast me out like garbage. And now he stood on my porch, gripping the railing for balance, as though my doorway had become the gatekeeper of his survival. My hand froze on the knob. Part of me wanted to open it, to look him in the eye and finally release years of words I had held inside. But another part of me, the part that remembered standing in the cold at 17, my belly swollen, my heart shattered, wanted to leave him there, just as he had left me. Finally, I cracked the door open, just enough to let my voice slip through. "Why are you here?" My tone was colder than I intended, but I didn't regret it. He swallowed hard, his hand trembling against the railing. "Claire," he rasped. The sound of my name in his voice made me flinch. "Please, just a moment. I need to see him. The boy. He choked on the word as if his mouth couldn't form it. "My grandson." The anger surged up before I could stop it. "Now you remember he exists," I snapped. "Now, after you've taken what you needed from him, after you've drained him, now you want to see him?" His eyes flickered with something. Guilt, maybe, or shame, but it was faint, a shadow of what it should have been. "I was wrong," he whispered. "That night, I was wrong. I thought I was protecting the family. I thought—" "Don't!" I cut him off sharply. My hands shook, but my voice didn't. Don't you dare stand there and pretend it was anything but pride. You weren't protecting anyone. You were protecting yourself, your reputation, your image, and you sacrificed me for it." His mouth opened, then closed again, the words withering before they formed. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in him, the kind of uncertainty that comes when a man realizes the power he once wielded no longer holds. Behind me, footsteps creaked. Daniel's voice floated down the stairs, soft but steady. "Mom, who is it?" Panic shot through me, but before I could stop him, he appeared at the landing. He froze when his eyes landed on the figure at the door. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. My father straightened as much as his weakened body allowed, his lips trembling. "Daniel," he said, as if the name itself were foreign on his tongue. I needed to see you, to thank you. You saved my life." Daniel's gaze was calm, unreadable, but I could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. He descended the stairs slowly, his movements careful but deliberate. When he reached me, he placed a hand on my shoulder, steadying me more than himself. He looked at my father for a long moment, then said quietly, "I didn't do it for you." The words landed like a hammer. My father blinked, stunned, as though he hadn't considered that possibility. Daniel continued, his voice stronger now. "I did it because it was the right thing, because my mom raised me to be better than what you were to her. But don't mistake that for forgiveness." My father's face crumpled, the years of arrogance peeling away like old paint. He reached out a trembling hand, but Daniel didn't move. I closed the door another inch, the barrier between us growing. "You wanted to see him," I said firmly. "Now you have, but this is the last time. We don't owe you visits. We don't owe you love. We don't owe you anything. Daniel already gave you more than you ever gave us. You'll live, but not with us in your life." His eyes glistened with tears, his hand falling limp at his side. "Please," he whispered, but the word rang hollow, too late, too shallow, too small to bridge the gulf between us. I shut the door gently, but firmly, the latch clicking into place, like the punctuation at the end of a story. I stood there for a long time, my forehead against the wood, listening to the sound of his ragged breathing on the other side. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, each one slower than the last, until silence reclaimed the night. I turned to Daniel, who was watching me with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Was that too harsh?" I asked softly, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head. "No," he said simply. "It was honest. And sometimes honesty is all that's left." We sat together on the couch after that, the weight of the encounter pressing down on us, but also lifting something at the same time. For 18 years, I had carried the ache of that slammed door, the wound of rejection, the longing for answers. Tonight, in a strange and painful way, it had closed. Not with forgiveness, not with reconciliation, but with clarity. He could beg, he could regret, he could cry, but he could never undo what he had done. And I would never let him harm Daniel the way he had harmed me. That night, after the door closed and the silence settled, I sat on the couch with Daniel, the weight of everything pressing down on me at once. My hands still trembled, not from fear, but from the release of years of tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. For nearly 2 decades, I had replayed that night in my head, the shouting, the slammed door, the cold air against my skin as I stood outside, abandoned. And tonight, standing on the other side of a door I got to close, I realized something important. I wasn't that scared 17-year-old anymore. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't broken. I was a mother, and I was free. Daniel leaned against me, his body still frail from the surgery, but his spirit unshaken. "Do you feel better?" he asked softly. His question caught me off guard. Did I feel better? I thought about it for a long moment. "Not better," I finally said. "Just lighter. Like I've been carrying a stone in my chest all these years, and now I can finally set it down." He nodded thoughtfully, then smiled faintly. "Good, because you don't deserve to carry anything that heavy anymore." In that moment, I knew the tables had fully turned, not just in fate, but in legacy. My father had once tried to strip me of dignity, of family, of worth. But standing here, with Daniel beside me, I knew I had built a life so much greater than the one I lost. The days that followed were strangely quiet. The phone rang less and less, until eventually it stopped altogether. Word must have spread through the family that I wasn't going to budge, that the door I closed that night was never going to open again. Sometimes, late at night, I would wonder if my father sat in his chair rereading that note, replaying our last encounter, haunted by what he had lost. And I knew, with a cold clarity, that his suffering wasn't my burden anymore. The punishment wasn't in my hands. It was in the silence of a life he could never re-enter, in the truth he would carry every single day, that his survival depended on the love he had once spat on, and that love had walked away. Daniel's recovery gave me something real to focus on. He grew stronger each day, his laughter returning, his brightness shining again. Watching him heal filled me with gratitude deeper than I could express. He never once second-guessed his choice. He never asked for thanks. He simply moved forward, the way he always had, carrying kindness like it was part of his very bones. And that was when it hit me. My father had called me a disgrace, but the boy I raised was proof that I had never been one. Daniel was my vindication. He was my answer to every cruel word, every slammed door, every silent year. I hadn't just survived. I had raised something beautiful out of the wreckage. On a rainy evening, not long after, Daniel and I sat by the window, watching the droplets race each other down the glass. He turned to me suddenly, his expression serious. "Mom, do you think you'll ever forgive him?" The question lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable. I thought about it carefully. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about letting him back in. It wasn't about absolving him of what he did. It was about releasing myself from the chains of his choices. Maybe someday, I admitted, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean we owe him anything. Daniel nodded slowly. "I think you already forgave him in your own way," he said. "You let me help him. That's more than he deserved." His words settled over me like truth. He was right. The act itself had been forgiveness enough. The rest wasn't mine to carry anymore. As the years moved on, life returned to its rhythm. Daniel continued his studies, determined to become a doctor after seeing firsthand what compassion and medicine could do. I watched him thrive, my pride swelling with every step. My father faded into the background of our lives, a ghost tethered only by the blood that now flowed through him. And though I didn't check, I knew he lived with the weight of our absence, with the silence that no apology could fill. That was his punishment, and it was far harsher than any vengeance I could have spoken aloud. One evening, years later, I stood in our kitchen watching Daniel laugh with friends around the table. Their voices filled the room, warm and alive, and I thought about the man who had once tried to steal all of this from me. He had tried to end my story before it even began, but here I was, surrounded by light, by love, by proof that he hadn't succeeded. And in that moment, I realized the truest revenge wasn't in the note, or in walking away, or even in denying him a place in our lives. The truest revenge was living a life so full, so unshakably whole, that his cruelty became irrelevant. And so, I'll leave you with this. If you were in my place, standing at that door with the man who once called you a disgrace, begging for forgiveness, what would you have done? Would you let him back in for the sake of family? Or would you close the door the way I did and finally set yourself free?